The military transport van dropped me off at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning so cold, my breath looked like cigarette smoke under the streetlights. The driver gave me a tired nod through the windshield, shifted into gear, and disappeared down Braddock Road without another word. No patriotic music, no dramatic reunion, just a gray Alexandria morning and 14 months of classified military work sitting in my lower back like a bad injury. I stood there for a second holding my canvas duffel bag, staring at my house. 3 stories, dark blue Victorian siding. White trim. I repainted myself during COVID because some contractor named Dean tried charging me $11,400 to do a sloppy job. Historic district headaches. Old oak tree near the sidewalk. Copper gutters that froze every winter no matter how much money I threw at them. I bought that house at 28 without help from anybody in my family, which, according to my father, was aggressive for a woman living alone. Richard Jenkins believed women should either marry money or inherit it politely. The idea that I made mine independently irritated him in a very personal way. The driveway still had the same crack near the garage, where Elias almost dropped an entire box of ceramic tiles last spring. I caught myself smiling at that. Elias Thorne was 78, walked with a damaged left leg from Vietnam, and complained about modern coffee like it was a war crime. I let him stay in the downstairs carriage suite rent-free after the VA delayed his disability housing paperwork for almost 11 months. The man once yelled at a self-checkout machine for talking with attitude. I liked him immediately. The porch light was off. That bothered me first. Elias always left the porch light on for me whenever I traveled, even if I told him not to waste electricity. The guy grew up during the Eisenhower administration and still acted like leaving one light bulb running would bankrupt the nation. I climbed the front steps slowly, boots heavy from the flight back from Germany. Then I noticed the front lock, new hardware, brushed nickel, cheap installation. The deadbolt sat slightly crooked in the wood like whoever installed it measured with pure confidence instead of a level. I stopped moving. For a few seconds, my brain tried offering reasonable explanations. Maybe Elias hired somebody. Maybe there'd been a break-in. Maybe the old lock finally jammed again. Then I saw the windows. Dark. Not nobody's awake yet dark. Empty dark. The kind of dark houses have when people stop existing inside them. I set my duffel bag down near the porch swing and knocked twice anyway. Nothing. I pulled my phone out and checked the time again, even though I already knew it. 6:19 a.m. My battery sat at 14% because military flights somehow still operate like it's 1987. I reached for my spare key hidden inside the fake landscaping rock near the hydrangeas. Gone. That's when I noticed the laminated paper taped directly to my front door. Not taped carelessly either. Centered perfectly. Clean edges. Somebody took time with it. I pulled it free and read the first line twice. Norter of Foreclosure and Profity Sureninger. The date printed near the bottom hit me harder than the headline. 3 weeks earlier, I kept it reading. The property had allegedly been declared abandoned under emergency custodial review due to owner incapacitation during overseas military assignment. Temporary transfer authority had been granted to Jenkins Urban Restoration Holdings pending liquidation proceedings. My father's company. I actually laughed once when I read that. Not because it was funny, because exhaustion does weird things to the human nervous system. The paper shook a little in my hand while cold air moved through the porch columns. Then I saw the smaller paragraph near the bottom. Occupants removed under lawful authority. Occupants, plural, meaning Elias. I looked through the front window again, pressing closer to the glass this time. The furniture was gone, not covered, gone. Even the piano bench near the staircase had disappeared. Who steals a piano bench? That thing weighed about as much as a refrigerator. I stepped back slowly and scanned the street. Everything around me looked painfully normal. Dog walker across the street. School bus at the intersection. A guy jogging in neon shorts despite weather that could freeze pipe joints. Meanwhile, I was apparently standing outside my own foreclosure. I called Elias first, straight to voicemail. I called again, same result. Then I called Chloe. Big mistake. My younger sister answered on the 4th ring, sounding half asleep and deeply annoyed to be alive before sunrise. Sarah, where's Elias? Silence, not confusion, not concern, just silence. I heard sheets moving around in the background. Then Chloe sighed, like I'd interrupted something important, probably online shopping or pretending to run her jewelry business. You shouldn't be there right now. I stared at the front door. What does that mean? Another pause. You need to call Dad. The second she said Dad, I already knew. You spend enough time in military intelligence, you learn how people sound when they already rehearsed a conversation. My father had rehearsed this one. Where is Elias? I asked again. I don't know. Lie, immediate lie. Chloe couldn't lie to save her life. She always added extra softness to her voice like a kindergarten teacher explaining why somebody's hamster died. Did you evict him? Sarah, the house was legally surrendered. My house. Well, technically. My house, I heard her exhale sharply. Then came the sentence that told me exactly who had engineered this entire thing. You were gone for over a year. Nobody knew if you were coming back. That line came directly from Richard Jenkins. Same wording. Same cold corporate rhythm. My father talked about human beings the way casinos talk about damaged carpeting. I looked back down at the foreclosure notice. There it was again. Presumed incapacitated. Temporary transfer authority. Abandoned property. Every word chosen by attorneys charging $400 an hour to make evil sound administrative. A freezing gust rolled across the porch and cut straight through my jacket. Chloe lowered her voice. Dad said the property had to be protected. Protected. The furniture gone. The locks changed. An old disabled veteran thrown out of his home. Protected. I picked up my duffel bag without answering her. Sarah? I hung up. Then I stood there another few seconds staring at the crooked deadbolt somebody installed on my front door like they were burying me in installments. Have you ever come home exhausted, loyal, and completely certain your family would protect your place in the world, only to realize they'd already divided up your life like furniture at an estate sale? Comment below. And if you enjoy smart revenge stories with real emotional weight instead of cheap drama, subscribe to the channel. I drove south on Interstate 395 with the heat blasting so hard the vents smelled like burned dust and old plastic. Rush hour had already started building near Seminary Road. Lawyers in BMWs, government contractors in Teslas. People screaming into Bluetooth headsets about quarterly forecasts like civilization depended on PowerPoint presentations. Meanwhile, I was technically homeless. I checked into a motel called the Cedar Grove Inn at 7:42 that morning because it was the closest place with vacancy and a functioning door lock. $65 a night. The lobby smelled like stale coffee and lemon disinfectant. A tiny artificial Christmas tree blinked near the ice machine, even though Thanksgiving hadn't happened yet. The woman at the front desk slid me my room key without making eye contact. Wi-Fi passwords on the receipt. Classy. Room 214 had brown carpet, flickering bathroom lights, and a chair that looked medically unsafe. The television remote was wrapped in plastic like evidence from a crime scene. Honestly, after 14 months sleeping near combat zones, I'd stayed in worse places. Barely. I locked the door, dropped my duffel beside the bed, and finally let myself sit still. That was the dangerous part, because once silence hits, your brain starts connecting things you were too tired to process before. My father hadn't acted emotionally. That mattered. Richard Jenkins didn't scream. He didn't slam doors. He didn't have dramatic family fights like normal toxic people. My father weaponized paperwork. He treated legal systems the same way rich people treat golf memberships. Tools for excluding people. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my bag and powered it on while the motel heater rattled like it was considering retirement. The familiar login screen settled my nerves immediately. Military routine, verification prompts, secure access tunnels, simple things made sense again. Outside the motel window, a guy wearing pajama pants was arguing with a vending machine over Doritos pricing. Inside, I started digging through county records. Alexandria property filings first, then probate petitions, then emergency custodial transfers. At 8:13 a.m., I found my father's name. I leaned back slowly in the motel chair and kept reading. Petitioner, Richard Allen Jenkins. Request for emergency temporary conservatorship. Basis, prolonged military disappearance and presumed incapacitation. Attached supporting documents included financial risk assessments, property abandonment claims, and an affidavit stating I had failed to establish contact for an unreasonable operational duration. Only my father could make his daughter sound like expired inventory. I opened the next attachment, then another, then another. Every page made my stomach colder. Richard had filed the petition 6 weeks into my deployment blackout period. He'd argued that my prolonged silence indicated possible death, capture, or psychological instability due to overseas combat exposure. Psychological instability, that one almost impressed me. Nothing says loving father like diagnosing your daughter through administrative fraud. I kept scrolling. He included copies of unanswered emails he'd sent to my military account, knowing full well classified blackout protocols prevented any response. He cited deteriorating property management concerns. He claimed tents had become vulnerable due to my absence. Then came the line that actually made me stop breathing for a second. Current occupant presents mobility limitations and potential liability exposure. Elias. That's how my father described a disabled Vietnam veteran who spent half his afternoons feeding stray cats behind the pharmacy on King Street. Liability exposure. I rubbed both hands across my face and stared at the screen. The motel heater clicked loudly behind me. Outside, a siren moved somewhere down the interstate. The world kept functioning while my family professionally erased me from it. Then I found Chloe. Not directly, financial records, corporate filings, debt restructuring notices. Her boutique company, Hayes Luxury Interiors, was drowning. 3 commercial loans overdue. 1 investor lawsuit pending. A warehouse lease default in Arlington. Total exposure, $447,218.63. There it was, the magic number, almost $500,000. I actually laughed again, quieter this time, because suddenly everything made horrible sense. My father didn't steal my property because he needed a house. He needed liquidity, fast liquidity. The Victorian property appraised at $1.8 million 6 months earlier, enough to erase Chloe's debt, stabilize her fake luxury business, and keep their country club image alive another few years. My entire existence had been converted into debt coverage for my sister's decorative furniture empire. I opened the eviction filing next. That one hit differently. Elias had been removed under Emergency Property Transfer Authority 11 days earlier by a private enforcement contractor called Dominion Asset Recovery Services. I searched the company name separately. 3 OSHA complaints, 2 civil lawsuits, 1 former employee review saying management treated elderly tenants like abandoned shopping carts. Amazing. My father literally outsourced human cruelty. There was also a signed witness statement claiming Elias had vacated voluntarily. That old man needed 15 seconds just to sit down comfortably in a booth at Denny's. Voluntarily, my ass. I grabbed the motel coffee cup from the nightstand and immediately regretted it. The coffee tasted like somebody melted aspirin into rainwater, still drank it. Military habit. At 9:26 a.m., I found the document that changed everything. Petition to declare service member missing and presumed incapacitated. Federal language. Court seal. Signed under oath. My father officially told the government I was functionally gone. Not dead enough for a funeral, just absent enough to steal from. That's a very specific kind of betrayal, the kind that takes that planning. I thought about all the times Richard bragged about family legacy at charity dinners while waiters refilled his wine glass. I remembered him once telling me, real power comes from controlling the paperwork before emotions start. At the time, I was 16 and thought he sounded intelligent. Turns out, he sounded like a Bond villain with a tax attorney. I stared at the motel wall for a long moment. No tears came. That surprised me a little. I wasn't heartbroken. Heartbreak belongs to misunderstandings. This was calculation. Cold, organized, signed in blue ink. The betrayal wasn't emotional anymore. It was procedural. Every document had timestamps, witness signatures, notary stamps, filing numbers. My father didn't just remove me from my home. He built an entire legal reality where I no longer existed long enough to monetize it. And somewhere during all of that, Elias got thrown into the street like damaged furniture nobody wanted to store. I adjusted my sunglasses lower on my nose and watched my father laugh over a seafood tower that probably cost more than my first car payment. Sunday brunch at Oakbrook Country Club started at 11 sharp, but Richard Jenkins treated it like a stage production. Investors arrived early. Staff hovered nervously. Everybody important sat where they could be seen. The man loved visibility almost as much as money. I sat alone near the far edge of the terrace beneath a large patio heater that barely worked. My coffee tasted burnt, the chair cushion was freezing, and somebody nearby kept wearing enough cologne to qualify as chemical warfare. 40 feet away, my family celebrated my disappearance with fresh orange juice and imported champagne. Very classy. The waitress had asked if I was meeting anyone. Not emotionally, I told her. She laughed harder than I expected. Oakbrook sat just outside Fairfax County on about 200 acres of carefully managed suburban fantasy. Perfect golf green. Decorative stone fountains. Men named Brent discussing market conditions while cheating on their second wives. My father practically considered the place church. He once told me country clubs existed because successful people deserve insulation from randomness. That sentence alone should qualify somebody for investigation. Richard sat at the center of the long terrace table, wearing a charcoal overcoat and a red tie that screamed courtroom confidence. Chloe sat beside him, scrolling through her phone between conversations, while occasionally extending her wrist into sunlight so people would notice the diamond tennis bracelet she suddenly owned. 7 carats minimum. Probably purchased with my equity. Good to see family values remained strong. I kept my expression neutral and stirred sugar into my coffee. I had no intention of drinking. Military work teaches you how to disappear in plain sight. Most civilians only see what confirms their expectations. At Oakbrook, people saw a woman in sunglasses sitting quietly alone and immediately categorized me as divorced. Honestly, fair assumption. A waiter carried fresh mimosas toward my father's table, while investors leaned closer to hear him speak. Richard loved speaking when people had money. I stepped in because nobody else was willing to handle the liability, he said loudly. Historic properties become financial sinkholes if families avoid hard decisions. There it was, the performance. Not a single mention that the family situation involved his deployed daughter coming home to find herself legally erased like a typo in Microsoft Word. One investor nodded sympathetically. Terrible situation. Richard sighed dramatically into his mimosa. Tragic, honestly. We still don't know of the full extent of her condition overseas. Condition. Interesting choice. I almost smiled. My father had apparently transformed me from missing soldier into unstable ghost woman over brunch cocktails. Chloe jumped in immediately. It's been really hard on Dad. That nearly killed me. Not emotionally. Physically. I almost choked on air. This man evicted a disabled veteran and stole my house through fraudulent federal filings, and somehow he was now the exhausted victim carrying the burden of leadership. American capitalism truly is performance art. An older investor named Martin Keene leaned forward carefully. So the property transfer finalizes this week? Richard nodded once. Wednesday morning. I watched him lift his crystal glass calmly, like he wasn't discussing theft disguised as estate management. The Alexandria market's still aggressive despite interest rates. We already have 2 buyers circling at around 1.8. 1.8. Just hearing the number out loud while sitting 30 feet away felt surreal. That house wasn't just property. Restored it room by room over 4 years. I rebuilt the upstairs library shelves myself after a contractor tried cutting corners with cheap pine framing. I spent entire weekends stripping wallpaper because previous owners apparently hated joy and loved floral nightmares. Every inch of that house contained actual labor. Meanwhile, my sister sat there touching diamonds. One of the investors glanced toward Chloe. Your interior firm still opening the Georgetown showroom? There it was. The real reason. Chloe smiled instantly, the way rich people do when pretending debt doesn't exist. We're expanding carefully. Lie. Her business wasn't expanding. It was drowning slowly in designer lighting invoices and bad decisions. I'd spent 2 days reviewing her financial filings. The woman owed so much money I was honestly surprised. Her handbags didn't have active warrants. Richard leaned back confidently. Family assets should protect family. I looked down at my coffee before my face gave me away. Because technically he was right. Family should protect family. That's what made this disgusting. Not the money, not even the fraud, the complete emotional absence behind it. My father wasn't conflicted. Chloe wasn't ashamed. Nobody at that table seemed haunted by what they'd done to Elias either. An old disabled veteran disappeared from his home, so Chloe could continue decorating luxury condos for people who think olive-colored couches count as personality, and they were eating crab cakes about it. The waitress returned to my table. You want another coffee? I glanced toward Richard. Yes, I said. I think this might become a drinking situation. She smirked slightly. Honestly? Fair. A cold breeze moved across the terrace as waiters lowered plastic weather panels along one side of the patio. My father continued talking. The hardest part is accepting that sometimes people simply can't return to normal life after military service. Wow, beautiful. Now he was collecting sympathy points, using combat trauma he'd never experienced. Richard Jenkins never served a single day in uniform. The closest he'd ever come to hardship was once getting stuck in Aspen during a snowstorm and describing it for years like he survived Fallujah. Martin Keene lowered his voice slightly. Any chance the daughter contests the transfer, Richard didn't even hesitate. No, that word hung there for a second. Calm, absolute, certain. He genuinely believed I was gone long enough to stop mattering. Chloe laughed softly while checking her bracelet again. You know Sarah, she said. She always cared more about rules than relationships. That one actually landed, because buried inside the manipulation was something true. I did care about rules. Contracts mattered, boundaries mattered, words signed under oath mattered. That's exactly why what they did was going to destroy them. Richard lifted his glass again, to difficult decisions. Everyone at the table raised theirs with polite suburban approval. Crystal clinked softly under the terrace heaters while my father celebrated the liquidation of my life, like a successful quarterly merger. They really believed the paperwork made them untouchable. That was the fascinating part. I locked the motel room door behind me, set the privacy latch, and pulled the curtains closed even though nobody cared enough to spy on room 214 at the Cedar Grove Inn. That wasn't paranoia. That was muscle memory. The afternoon light disappeared behind the cheap floral curtains, while the heater rattled beside the window like it was losing an argument with itself. Somewhere outside, a couple screamed at each other in the parking lot over a Dodge Charger with one missing hubcap. America was functioning normally. I placed my laptop on the small motel desk and checked the time. 4:47 p.m. My father's probate hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9. Less than 48 hours away. Plenty of time. That's the thing people misunderstand about military intelligence officers. Most civilians think we spend our lives chasing danger dramatically through dark hallways while orchestral music plays in the background. Mostly it's calendars, deadlines, documentations, patience. The dangerous people are usually the quiet ones with organized folders. I crouched beside my duffel bag and unzipped the lower storage compartment hidden beneath the clothing layer. Most people never noticed it existed unless they packed military gear regularly. Inside sat a sealed manila folder wrapped in waterproof plastic. Heavy, untouched. The insignia, stamped across the front, stopped looking intimidating to me years ago, but civilians usually reacted like they'd just seen nuclear launch codes. Judge Advocate General's Corps, JAG. I rested the folder carefully on the desk and stared at it for a second without opening it. The funny part? My father accidentally triggered the exact legal mechanism designed to destroy people like him. 14 months earlier, before deployment, I sat inside a secure legal office at Fort Belvoir while Captain Denise Holloway walked me through conditional asset protections for classified operations personnel. Most soldiers used basic wills. Mine was different, because intelligence deployments came with complications, communication blackouts, unconfirmed locations, operational ambiguity, situations where technically alive starts looking legally inconvenient. Captain Holloway had pushed the folder toward me that day and said something I never forgot. Families panic. Predators improvise. Paperwork survives both. At the time, I thought she was being overly cynical. Turns out, Denise Holloway understood rich people perfectly. I broke the seal. Inside sat 23 pages of federal legal protections tied directly to deployment contingencies under military jurisdiction. Property trusts, emergency asset conversion clauses, tenant protections, durable authority limitations, and one very specific provision. If prolonged operational silence resulted in civilian attempts to seize, liquidate, or transfer my estate through incapacity claims, all protected property holdings automatically transferred in temporary federal trust oversight pending military verification review. Translation? My father didn't steal private property. He accidentally interfered with federally protected military assets. That's a completely different category of disaster. I leaned back slowly in the motel chair and almost felt bad for him. Almost. The trust documents also contained another detail Richard definitely never anticipated. Elias Thorne's name, protected dependent occupant under military beneficiary housing designation. I added him 6 months before deployment after his VA situation got worse. Nothing complicated. Just legal protection ensuring nobody could remove him while I was overseas. Apparently, my father's attorneys either missed that clause or assumed nobody would challenge them quickly enough to matter. That's what arrogance does. It speeds people past warning signs. I spent the next 6 hours building timelines. Not emotional timelines, evidence timelines. Every filing, every transfer, every signature. I cross-referenced county submissions against federal military status records and identified at least 4 direct contradictions under oath. By 11:18 p.m., I already knew Richard committed perjury, twice, possibly 5 times depending how aggressive the court decided to become. I ordered Chinese takeout from a place across the interstate because the motel vending machine looked like a hepatitis side quest. The delivery guy handed me sesame chicken through the security glass in the lobby and said, "Long night?" I almost answered. My father accidentally committed federal fraud against the Department of Defense, but settled for family stuff. He nodded immediately. That's the universal American phrase for emotional warfare. Sunday morning started with black coffee and military legal calls. Captain Holloway answered at 7:06 a.m., sounding disturbingly cheerful for somebody reading fraud documentation before breakfast. "Jesus Christ," she muttered after reviewing the filings I sent overnight. "Good morning to you too," I said. "No, Sarah, seriously. Your father is an idiot." That actually helped a little. People assume legal professionals speak dramatically all the time. Most don't. The attorneys sound annoyed more than theatrical. Holloway spent 40 minutes outlining federal exposure scenarios while I typed notes into encrypted files. Fraudulent incapacitation declarations, illegal seizure of protected assets, potential elder abuse violations involving Elias, improper interference with military operational protections. Every sentence sounded more expensive than the last. Then came the important part. "Do not contact your father directly," she said firmly. "Do not threaten him. Do not warn him. Let him continue." Continue. That word mattered. Because people bury themselves fastest when they think they're winning. By Sunday afternoon, I had copies of every hearing document scheduled for Monday morning in federal district court. Richard believed Monday would finalize liquidation authority. Instead, Monday was going to become educational. I spent the evening reviewing procedural order, chain of custody, filing timestamps, court seating arrangements. At one point, I caught my reflection in the motel mirror wearing gray sweatpants and military thermal layers while eating cold lomin over a stack of federal fraud statutes. Honestly, I looked like the world's angriest accountant. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the motel window. Inside, my father's entire future slowly collapsed into organized paperwork. And the strangest part? I still wasn't thinking about revenge. Not really. I was thinking about Elias standing somewhere in the cold, wondering why nobody came back for him. That old man trusted me, trusted my house, trusted the idea that some promises still meant something in this country. Richard violated that for money, Chloe violated it for lifestyle maintenance, and now both of them were walking confidently toward a federal courtroom, believing expensive lawyers could protect them from consequences they didn't fully understand. That's the problem with people who mistake wealth for intelligence. Eventually, they hit something built stronger than confidence. A fortress is invisible right up until the moment you break your hand against the wall. I arrived at the federal district court at 8:11 Monday morning, carrying a plain black garment bag and enough documented evidence to ruin several expensive careers before lunch. The air outside smelled like wet concrete and burnt coffee from a food cart parked near the entrance. Government employees moved through security with the exhausted speed of people who'd already accepted disappointment as part of their healthcare plan. I kept my head down and walked through the metal detectors wearing civilian clothes. Gray coat, dark pants, hair tied back, invisible. Courtroom 4B sat on the 3rd floor near the end of a polished hallway lined with framed judicial portraits of dead men who looked deeply offended by modern society. Federal buildings always feel oddly frozen in time. Beige walls, quiet tension. Carpets that probably witnessed crimes against architecture. I took a seat near the back corner at 8:37 and waited. Richard arrived first. Of course he did. My father treated court appearances like business mergers. He entered with his attorney beside him, carrying 2 leather portfolios and the kind of confidence only wealthy men and bad surgeons possess. Richard wore a navy Brioni suit that probably cost around $6,000. Same silver cufflinks, same posture, same expression he used at charity galas while pretending to care about pediatric hospitals. Chloe followed about 2 minutes later in a cream-colored coat with oversized sunglasses and heels completely incompatible with winter weather or common sense. She looked rested. That irritated me more than it should have. Somewhere out there, Elias was probably sleeping in temporary veteran housing while my sister moisturized through felony fraud. Chloe leaned toward my father after sitting down. "You think this'll take long?" Richard barely looked up from his paperwork. 20 minutes if the judge isn't difficult. That line almost made me laugh. Judges love being called difficult by real estate developers committing federal fraud. Excellent strategy. Their attorney, Malcolm Pierce, organized documents neatly across the plaintiff table while quietly reviewing procedural notes. Mid-50s, expensive haircut, permanent expression of somebody billing by the syllable. Pierce worried me slightly. Unlike Richard and Chloe, he looked alert. At 8:51, he paused while reviewing one specific filing and frowned. Good. That meant at least one functioning brain had entered the building. I watched him lean closer toward my father. Did military confirmation ever arrive? Richard dismissed the question immediately. Operational blackout. We already covered that. That's not the same thing. She's been gone 14 months. Pierce adjusted his glasses slowly. Richard, federal courts don't love assumptions involving active duty personnel. Smart man. Too late, but smart. My father lowered his voice impatiently. The estate transfer is already supported by conservatorship authorization. We're not reopening this. There it was again. That absolute certainty wealthy people develop after spending too many years confusing influence with immunity. At exactly 9 a.m., the side door opened. Everyone stood. Judge Arthur Vance entered carrying a thick case binder beneath one arm and reading glasses in the other hand. Late 50s, maybe. Broad shoulders. Military posture despite civilian robes. Interesting. He sat down slowly and scanned the courtroom once before speaking. Be seated. Nobody moved much after that. Federal courtrooms have a different atmosphere than local courts. It's less drama. More quiet fear. People speak softer because consequences feel heavier. Judge Vance reviewed the file silently for almost 30 seconds while the room settled. Then his eyebrows tightened slightly. Also good. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Malcolm Pierce. Counselor, I have several questions regarding the petitioner's emergency incapacitation claims. Pierce stood smoothly. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped one document lightly. This filing repeatedly references Captain Sarah Jenkins as presumed incapacitated due to prolonged military absence. Yes, Your Honor. And yet I do not currently see direct confirmation from the Department of Defense supporting either death status, capture status, or medical incapacitation. Silence. Small silence. Dangerous silence. Richard shifted slightly beside his attorney. Your Honor, communication interruption during classified overseas operations complicated verification procedures. Judge Vance didn't blink. I'm aware classified deployments exist, Counselor. I served 8 years in the Marine Corps. Well, that changed the temperature instantly. I watched Chloe glance nervously toward my father for the first time all morning. Vance continued reading. You're requesting liquidation authority over a $1.8 million property based primarily on inferred absence. Pierce maintained his professional tone. Combined with extended silence, property vulnerability concerns, and fiduciary preservation obligations. That sounded polished. Also completely insane. The judge turned another page. Interesting phrase here, he read aloud. The service member has likely lost functional civilian continuity. What exactly does that mean? Pierce hesitated. Not long, just enough. Richard leaned sideways and muttered something under his breath, probably trying to steer the conversation back toward confidence. Then came my favorite part. My father got bored. Seriously. The man actually leaned back in his chair and whispered casually to Chloe while a federal judge questioned the legitimacy of their filings. The wire should clear tomorrow afternoon, he murmured. Tell Brent not to panic about payroll. There it was. The entire reason. My existence had become bridge financing for a goose-felling lifestyle company. Chloe relaxed instantly after hearing that. I told him we'd be fine. Richard smirked faintly. You worry too much. I stared at both of them from the back row and realized something strange. They genuinely believed this was over. Not emotionally over. Administratively over. The paperwork comforted them. Stamped forms, court filings, legal language. People like my father treat documentation almost religiously. If enough expensive attorneys touch a lie, eventually rich people start believing it becomes reality. Judge Vance closed the file halfway and folded his hands. One final concern. Now the room felt different. Even the clerk stopped typing for a second. The judge looked directly toward Richard. Mr. Jenkins, can you personally explain why the military has never officially acknowledged your daughter's incapacity, despite your repeated legal assertions that she is effectively unable to resume civilian control? Richard stood slowly. Calm, polished, confident. The performance voice returned immediately. Your Honor, this has been an incredibly painful process for our family. Of course, weaponized grief. Classic Richard. He lowered his head slightly like a man carrying emotional burdens instead of federal liability. We simply had to make responsible decisions in the absence of certainty. Judge Vance studied him carefully without speaking. And for the first time that morning, I noticed something tiny shift inside the courtroom. Not panic, not suspicion, momentum. Because right before systems collapse, there's usually one quiet moment where people still think they're in control. I waited until Richard finished pretending to be a grieving father before I stood up outside courtroom 4B and adjusted the collar on my army dress uniform one final time. The hallway smelled faintly like floor polish and government coffee. Captain Denise Holloway stood beside me holding a slim black case file against her hip. Her expression remained calm in the way military attorneys always look calm right before detonating somebody's future. "You ready?" she asked quietly. I glanced toward the courtroom doors. "No," I said honestly. "But they are." That got the smallest smile out of her. I took one breath, squared my shoulders, and pushed the doors open. The sound hit the courtroom harder than I expected. Heavy oak, solid federal hardware. One sharp crack against silence. Every head turned immediately. Combat boots sound different indoors. Sharper, more deliberate. Especially against polished marble flooring in a federal courtroom where everybody already feels nervous before lunch. I walked straight down the center aisle, wearing full Army Class A dress uniform with my service ribbons fixed perfectly above the left breast pocket, and combat decorations reflecting beneath the fluorescent lights overhead. No rushing, no drama, no anger. That's what frightened them. People expect emotional explosions during family betrayal, crying, screaming, pointing fingers across courtrooms like daytime television. Instead, I just kept walking. The room became completely silent except for my footsteps. Behind the plaintiff table, Chloe froze first. Her face emptied so fast it actually looked painful. Then her handbag slipped off her lap and crashed onto the courtroom floor loud enough to make somebody near the gallery flinch. Lipstick rolled underneath the adjacent chair. Nobody moved to help her. Richard looked up slowly. For a peck, my father genuinely didn't understand what he was seeing. That part stayed with me afterward. The confusion, not guilt, not relief. Pure confusion. Like his brain physically rejected the image standing in front of him because it contradicted paperwork he already emotionally trusted. Color drained from his face one terrifying inch at a time. He looked older instantly. Not emotionally older. Physically older. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Good. I stopped beside the defense table and turned toward Judge Vance. Then I saluted. Sharp, controlled, precise. Captain Sarah Jenkins reporting as ordered. Your Honor. The courtroom stayed dead quiet. Judge Vance removed his glasses slowly without taking his eyes off me. Well, that was one way to answer his earlier question about military confirmation. Richard's attorney stood frozen beside the plaintiff table, gripping a stack of documents that had just transformed from legal strategy into evidence. Somewhere in the back row, somebody whispered, "Holy hell, honestly?" Fair reaction. Judge Vance recovered first. As captain? Yes, Your Honor. My father still hadn't spoken. He just stared at me like he'd seen a ghost walk out of Arlington Cemetery holding legal documents. And technically, he had. Because 3 weeks earlier, Richard Jenkins officially told the federal government I was functionally absent from civilian existence. Now, I was standing 20 feet away in dress uniform while his fraud sat organized neatly inside court records. That's a rough Monday morning. Judge Vance looked toward Malcolm Pierce. "Counselor," he said carefully, "would you like to revise any prior statements made before this court regarding Captain Jenkins' status?" Pierce closed his eyes briefly. Tiny movement, but devastating. Because that was the exact moment he realized his client probably lied to him too. "No immediate revision at this time, Your Honor," he answered cautiously. Translation? My client may have accidentally set himself on fire, and I'd like several more seconds before touching the flames. Chloe finally found her voice. "Sarah." I didn't look at her, that hurt her more. People like Chloe survive on emotional access, attention, reactions, conversations where they can still negotiate sympathy. Silence terrifies them. Richard stood slowly from the plaintiff table. "You're alive. Interesting. Phrasing. Not thank God. Not, you okay? Just administrative surprise eyes." I met his eyes calmly. "That appears to be creating complications for you." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, trying not to react. Judge Vance definitely reacted, though. I caught the corner of his mouth tighten slightly before he covered it with a cough. Even federal judges appreciate good sarcasm occasionally. Richard attempted recovery mode instantly. Sarah, there's been a misunderstanding. Of course. The classic rich person emergency phrase. Misunderstanding. Like fraudulent federal filings happen accidentally during printer malfunctions. I set a sealed manila folder carefully onto the defense table. No misunderstanding, actually. Captain Holloway stepped forward beside me. Captain Denise Holloway, United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. That changed the atmosphere again. Military legal involvement inside civilian federal court feels very different once it becomes visible. The room stopped feeling like probate litigation and started feeling dangerously official. Holloway handed documentation directly to the court clerk, requesting immediate review of federally protected deployment trust provisions and associated unlawful seizure actions. Richard blinked once, slowly. There it was, the first real crack. Because my father finally realized this situation existed outside his financial ecosystem now. Outside country clubs, outside private attorneys, outside relationships built through donations and networking lunches. Federal systems don't care who sponsors the hospital gala. Judge Vance opened the folder while the clerk distributed copies. His expression hardened almost immediately after reading the first page. Then the second, then the third. "Oh," he muttered softly. Not dramatic, honestly worse. The kind of "oh" professionals use when discovering somebody made a life-altering mistake with signatures involved. Richard looked toward his attorney. Pierce no longer looked confident. That was new. Judge Vance adjusted his glasses again. "Mr. Jackson," he said carefully, "did you know this property entered protected federal trust status 14 months ago under conditional military deployment authority?" Silence. Richard swallowed visibly. "No." Judge Vance looked down again. "And did you know Elias Thorne was listed under protected veteran occupancy designation connected to that trust?" More silence, longer this time. My father's face had gone almost gray, because now he understood the scale. This wasn't family manipulation anymore. This was federal exposure. Paper trails, false statements under oath, illegal seizure of protected assets, improper removal of a disabled veteran. Everything suddenly existed in permanent legal language instead of brunch conversation. I watched Richard stare at the paperwork spread across the table in front of him, like numbers on a terminal diagnosis. For the first time in my entire life, my father looked genuinely afraid. The dead had officially returned, and they brought documents. Judge Vance kept turning pages while the courtroom slowly realized this was no longer a probate hearing. It was an autopsy. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the faint hum of overhead fluorescent lights and Chloe breathing too fast beside the plaintiff table, like somebody trapped in a collapsing elevator. Richard remained standing, but barely. I'd seen soldiers hold themselves together better after roadside explosions. Funny what fear does when it finally reaches people who thought consequences only happened to civilians with smaller bank accounts. I stepped forward calmly and lifted the second manila folder from the defense table. Thicker, darker seal. Military classification markings across the front. The courtroom clerk glanced at it and immediately straightened in her seat. People react differently when documents look expensive enough to involve prison. I turned toward Judge Vance and gave another precise salute. "Your Honor, requesting submission of conditional deployment will and federal trust directive executed prior to overseas assignment." Judge Vance extended his hand carefully. "Approach." I handed him the sealed packet. The courtroom watched in complete silence while he broke the seal and opened the file. Then his expression changed. Not shock exactly, recognition. Like a man who suddenly understood why the floor beneath him felt unstable. He adjusted his glasses lower and began reading. The first page outlined military deployment continuity protections under federal jurisdiction. The second established conditional estate transfer restrictions. Then he reached page 4. That's where everything died. Judge Vance looked up slowly. "Captain Jengs," he said carefully, "this document indicates the Alexandria property entered protected veteran housing trust status effective the moment deployment commenced." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge kept reading. "The trust beneficiary structure includes disabled veteran occupancy preservation under federal review authority." Another page turned, then another. Meanwhile, Richard stared at the table like he physically could not process the language anymore. Because rich people survive by understanding systems. Once systems become incomprehensible, panic arrives fast. Judge Vance continued aloud. Specific hostile party exclusion clause. That got everyone's attention. Even Malcolm Pierce looked alarmed now. The judge read directly from the document. In the event of coercive estate interference, fraudulent incapacitation claims, unlawful civilian seizure attempts, or forced displacement of protected occupants, all named hostile entities, shall be subject to immediate federal review and legal referral. Then he stopped reading. Very slowly, Judge Vance looked toward my father. Mr. Jenkins, Richard swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor. The judge removed his glasses completely. You are explicitly named in this document. The room went dead silent, not courtroom silent, funeral home silent. Chloe blinked rapidly beside him. What does that mean? She whispered. Nobody answered her immediately because the answer was catastrophic. Judge Vance flipped another page. Captain Jenkins executed this will 14 months ago before deployment through military legal authority with full federal registration and protective activation protocols. Richard's attorney finally stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may. You may not, Vance interrupted sharply. That landed hard. Federal judges rarely cut attorneys off unless patience has officially expired. Judge Vance tapped several documents together against the bench. Your client submitted sworn statements claiming Captain Jenkins' assets were abandoned civilian property vulnerable to custodial transfer. Pierce stayed quiet. Good decision. The judge continued. Those filings now appear materially false. Appear. Important legal word. Still polite enough for procedure. Still terrifying enough for reality. I remained standing silently beside the defense table while Judge Vance reviewed the remaining pages. No yelling necessary. That's the beautiful thing about documented truth. It performs perfectly fine without emotional assistance. Then the judge reached the eviction filings involving Elias. That changed his expression completely. Mr. Jenkins, he said slowly, did you authorize removal proceedings against protected occupant Elias Thorne? Richard finally tried speaking again. We were advised the tenant situation created liability concerns. That is not what I asked. The sharpness in Vance's voice snapped through the courtroom instantly. Richard froze. Judge Vance lifted the eviction paperwork. This disabled veteran was legally protected under federally registered occupancy designation tied directly to active duty deployment authority. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. The judge looked down again. And according to these filings, Dominion Asset Recovery Services forcibly removed him 11 days ago. Richard's face looked almost gray now. He opened his mouth once, closed it, then tried again. My understanding was... Your understanding, Judge Vance interrupted, appears to have involved submitting forged incapacity assumptions to seize federally protected property while unlawfully displacing a disabled veteran. There it was. Not accusation anymore. Definition. Across the courtroom, Chloe started crying quietly. Not emotional crying, fear crying, huge difference, mascara panic. The kind people experience when expensive lifestyles suddenly collide with criminal statutes. Judge Vance leaned back slowly. I want the record to reflect that Captain Sarah Jenkins was actively serving overseas while these transfer attempts occurred. The court reporter nodded immediately. And I further want the record to reflect, the judge continued, that the plaintiff pursued liquidation authority despite lacking formal military confirmation of death, incapacity, or operational termination. Richard's breathing became visibly uneven. I watched his right hand grip the edge of the plaintiff table harder and harder, still trying to stay upright, still trying to calculate escape routes. That's what my father always did. Math, risk, leverage. But greed creates terrible mathematicians eventually because arrogance starts subtracting consequences from equations. Judge Vance lowered his voice slightly. Mr. Jenkins, are you aware perjury involving federal military protections may carry criminal penalties exceeding 10 years? That was it. The exact moment. You could actually see the number hit him physically. 10 years. Not financial penalties. Not embarrassment. Not settlements. Prison. Real prison. No country club memberships there. No investor brunches. No valet parking. Just concrete and consequences. Richard's knees buckled suddenly against the plaintiff table. Chloe gasped loudly. Malcolm Pierce lunged sideways trying to catch him, but too late. My father collapsed hard onto the courtroom floor with a sick, heavy sound that echoed against the marble. Several people stood instinctively. One of the federal marshals moved immediately toward him, while Chloe dropped beside the body screaming, Dad? Dad, honestly? The scream sounded more offended than heartbroken. Judge Vance remained perfectly calm. Call medical. Court staff rushed forward while papers scattered across the floor around Richard's unconscious body. Fraud filings, transfer requests, forged assumptions. All the careful paperwork that erased me from my own life now lay spread around him like broken lottery tickets. I looked down at my father lying unconscious beneath fluorescent courtroom lights and felt something unexpected. Not victory, not satisfaction, just emptiness. Because the truly devastating part wasn't watching him collapse. It was realizing he had gambled his entire soul for money that probably wouldn't even impress billionaires. The math of his greed finally finished solving itself. I picked up my military cover from the defense table, while paramedics moved around my unconscious father like exhausted mechanics, responding to an engine failure nobody wanted to touch. The courtroom had completely dissolved by then. Court clerks whispered urgently near the bench. Attorneys gathered papers with the frantic energy of people suddenly reconsidering their career choices. Somebody near the gallery quietly slipped out the side exit, probably headed toward a phone call beginning with, "You are not going to believe this." Meanwhile, Richard Jenkins remained flat on the marble floor beside the same fraudulent documents he used to erase me from my own life. There's probably poetry in that somewhere. Not my problem. Chloe still knelt beside him, crying hard enough to ruin several $1,000s of makeup and self-respect. One of her heels had snapped sideways during the panic, leaving her tilted awkwardly against the plaintiff table. For the first time in years, she looked less like a socialite and more like a terrified little sister who suddenly realized Dad couldn't buy gravity. A federal marshal approached quietly from behind her. "Mom," he said carefully, "please stand up." Chloe looked confused, then offended. That came faster. "What?" The marshal stayed calm. "We need you to stand." Another marshal moved beside him holding paperwork. I recognized the expression immediately. Professional restraint. The facial look law enforcement officers use when they already know somebody's afternoon is about to become significantly worse. Chloe glanced wildly toward Malcolm Pierce. "My lawyer?" "I am not your lawyer," Pierce interrupted instantly. "Honestly?" Cold move. Smart move. But cold. The second marshal unfolded the document. "Chloe Jenkins Hayes, you are being detained pending federal review involving financial conspiracy and unlawful asset coordination tied to fraudulent estate seizure proceedings." Chloe stared at him blankly. People always look confused when consequences stop being theoretical. "There has to be some mistake," she whispered. That word again. Mistake. Rich families love calling organized greed a mistake once handcuffs appear. The marshal guided her wrists gently behind her back while she started crying harder. Not one person in the courtroom moved to stop it. That part mattered. All those country club investors, all those expensive attorneys, all those people who toasted difficult decisions over mimosas 48 hours earlier. Gone quiet now, because wealth creates very loyal friendships right up until federal marshals enter the conversation. The handcuffs clicked softly. Tiny sound. Huge meaning. I watched Chloe lower her head as the marshals escorted her toward the side exit, passing directly beside the same plaintiff table where she once discussed my house like upcoming inventory. She looked at me one time while passing. I expected anger, maybe blame. Instead, she looked lost, like somebody who spent too many years confusing protection with love. I didn't hate her in that moment. That surprised me. Hating people requires emotional energy, and honestly, my family had already overdrafted that account years ago. Judge Vance called for recess while paramedics stabilized Richard onto a stretcher. Even unconscious, my father still looked irritated. Consistent branding. Captain Holloway gathered the remaining legal files into her briefcase and exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, "that escalated exactly how I expected." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I looked toward the courtroom doors. "I need to find Elias." That shifted her expression immediately. Everything else suddenly felt smaller once I said his name out loud. The money, the fraud, the courtroom spectacle. An old man still lost his home in all of this. Holloway nodded once. "We already started tracking temporary placement records through Veterans Affairs." "Alive?" She looked directly at me. "Yes." That single word released tension from my chest I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. "Alive. Good." Outside the courthouse, the morning air hit cold and bright against my face. Washington mornings always smell faintly like wet pavement and ambition. Traffic crawled past the federal buildings while people hurried toward offices holding coffee cups and unfinished conversations. Normal life. That's the strange thing about personal disasters. The rest of the world keeps ordering bagels and missing parking spaces like nothing happened. I stood there for a second at the top of the courthouse steps wearing full dress, uniform, while cameras from 2 local news crews started gathering near the sidewalk below. Apparently, federal fraud involving military property and wealthy developers attracts attention. Who knew? One reporter shouted, "Captain Jenkins, any statement?" I kept walking. Another yelled, "Do you forgive your family?" That one almost stopped me. Not because I needed to answer. Because Americans are weirdly obsessed with forgiveness, like it's morally superior to boundaries. I turned slightly toward the microphones. I believe people should live with the consequences of the choices they make. Then I left. No dramatic speeches, no revenge monologue. Just truth. My rental car still smelled faintly like motel coffee and rain-damp clothing. I drove north through Alexandria with one hand resting lightly against the steering wheel, while late morning sunlight broke through the clouds over King Street. The closer I got to home, the calmer I felt. Not happy, not triumphant, steady. The historic Victorian house appeared at the end of the block exactly where it always had. Blue siding, white trim, old oak tree near the curb. Still standing, that mattered too. Some damage can be repaired once dishonest people stop touching things. I parked slowly along the curb and sat quietly for a minute looking at the front porch. The crooked replacement deadbolt was still there. Cheap installation. Lazy alignment. My father really should have hired better contractors for criminal activity. I shook my head slightly and stepped out of the car. For the first time since returning home, the house no longer looked stolen, just waiting. I thought about Elias feeding stray cats behind the pharmacy. I thought about sleeping in motel rooms while rich people drank champagne over my legal obituary. I thought about Richard collapsing under the weight of his own paperwork. And standing there in the cold November sunlight, I finally understood something my father never did. Dignity does not come from bloodlines. It does not come from wealth. And it definitely does not come from country club applause or expensive signatures. Real dignity comes from the boundaries you protect when protecting them costs you something. My family spent their entire lives chasing status. I was finally heading north toward something better, home. I spent the next 3 weeks changing locks, replacing paperwork, and learning how strange a house can feel after people try to legally erase you from it. That sounds dramatic, but honestly, most of recovery looked painfully ordinary. Hardware stores, insurance calls, coffee gone cold while sitting on hold with utility companies that somehow still played jazz music from 1994. Meanwhile, Elias sat at my kitchen table every morning, complaining about the temporary VA housing they stuck him in after the eviction. They served eggs with the texture of drywall, he told me one Tuesday. That's probably illegal. I hope so. Then he kept eating my toast. That old man survived Vietnam and somehow still considered free breakfast his greatest personal enemy. I liked having him back in the house, not because things magically felt normal again. They didn't. Normal was gone. But silence stopped feeling hostile. That mattered. One afternoon, while reinstalling security cameras near the back porch, I realized something I wish somebody had explained to me years earlier. The most dangerous people rarely look dangerous at first. They look responsible, organized, helpful. My father never acted like a movie villain. He wore tailored suits, donated to children's hospitals, remembered birthdays, and tipped valets like he was running for office. Meanwhile, the man quietly built an entire legal strategy to steal from his deployed daughter. That's why manipulation confuses so many people. Because real manipulation almost never arrives screaming. It arrives calmly. Sometimes carrying paperwork, sometimes carrying concern, sometimes saying things like, "I'm only trying to help." I think a lot of people watching this story probably understand exactly what I mean. Maybe not through military fraud or federal courtrooms, but through smaller moments that slowly taught you your comfort mattered less than keeping somebody else happy. A parent who made you feel guilty for having boundaries. A sibling who only called when they needed money. A partner who acted wounded every time you said no to something unreasonable. That kind of behavior builds slowly, like mold behind walls. By the time you clearly see it, the damage already spread everywhere. And the hardest part? People around you often normalize it. That's what happened with Chloe for years. Everybody excused her behavior because she was sensitive. which was interesting considering most of her sensitivity disappeared whenever restaurant bills arrived. My sister learned early that emotions worked like coupons in our family. If she cried first, she usually won. I learned the opposite. Stay composed. Stay useful. Don't complain. Turns out emotionally disciplined daughters make excellent targets for manipulative families because everybody assumes they can absorb damage quietly. That lesson cost me a house. And almost cost Elias his safety too. One evening, I found myself sitting on the front porch, with him watching traffic roll past the neighborhood, while contractors repaired damage from the forced eviction. Elias looked over at me and said, "Your father always talked like he was negotiating with the world." That sentence stuck with me. Because it was true. Richard Jenkins negotiated every relationship through leverage, reputation, financial advantage, emotional pressure. Nothing stayed simple around him. Even kindness became transactional eventually. And once I finally understood that, something inside me got quieter, not colder, just clearer. That's the difference people misunderstand. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Distance is not hatred. Sometimes protecting yourself is simply refusing to participate in your own destruction anymore. I wish more people understood that, especially adults carrying guilt from toxic family relationships, because manipulative people train you carefully over time. They teach you that obedience equals love, that silence equals maturity, that tolerating disrespect makes you the bigger person. It doesn't. Usually it just makes you exhausted. The military actually helped me understand this better than therapy ever did. Inside the Army, expectations are documented clearly. Authority has limits. Violations have consequences. Nobody gets to rewrite reality because they cried louder during dinner. But families? Families blur lines constantly. People invade emotional space for years and call it closeness. Then one day you finally push back, and suddenly everybody acts shocked that you stopped volunteering for emotional demolition duty. Funny how that works. I also learned something uncomfortable after the courtroom incident. A lot of people admired me more after I fought back successfully. Not before, after. That bothered me. Because human beings love survivors but often ignore people while they're actively drowning. The same relatives who quietly tolerate abuse for years suddenly become philosophers once somebody escapes it. You did the right thing. You're so strong. I always knew something was off. Great. Could have used that energy earlier, Brenda. But honestly, I don't blame people as much anymore. Most families operate through patterns nobody questions until somebody finally refuses their assigned role. Mine assigned me competence. Chloe got protection. Richard got authority. And when I stopped cooperating with those roles, the entire structure collapsed under its own dishonesty. That collapse hurt, a lot more than losing the house temporarily, because the real grief wasn't financial. It was realizing my family loved the version of me that stayed manageable, useful, predictable, quiet. The second I became inconvenient to their plans, they replaced me with paperwork. That realization changes you permanently, but strangely enough, it also frees you. Because once illusions die, clarity finally gets room to breathe. And clarity is a much safer place to build a life. I think one of the strangest parts of the entire situation happened about 2 months later at a grocery store. A woman recognized me from a local news clip while I was standing near frozen pizzas debating whether I respected myself enough to buy something called cauliflower fiesta crust. Apparently not. She walked over carefully and said, "You're that Army officer, right? The one who exposed her family?" I nodded once. Then she said something I heard a lot afterward. "You're so strong. People meant well when they said that." I understood the intention. But honestly, strength had very little to do with why I survived that situation. Preparation saved me. Documentation saved me. Thinking clearly while emotional saved me. And I wish more people understood the difference because Hollywood has completely destroyed the average person's understanding of survival. Most people think survival looks dramatic. It usually looks organized. Folders, receipts, copies of signed documents, passwords nobody else controls. That's the unsexy truth. I didn't walk into federal court and magically overpower my father through confidence and inspirational music. I walked in protected because 14 months earlier, I sat in a legal office and handled paperwork carefully while everybody else treated deployment planning like a boring administrative task. That decision changed everything. And honestly, that's probably the biggest practical lesson I can give anybody listening to this story. Please understand what you sign. Please Please keep copies of important records. Please stop assuming family would never do that, because unfortunately, some people absolutely would. Especially once money enters the room. Money changes conversations fast. Sometimes it reveals character. Sometimes it removes the mask entirely. Elias understood that better than most people I know. A few weeks after returning home, I took him to breakfast at a diner near Route 1 because he claimed the coffee there was slightly less insulting than average. High praise from Elias. We sat in a cracked vinyl booth while he drowned pancakes in enough syrup to medically concern nearby adults. Then he looked at me and said, "Rich people always think paper belongs to them." I laughed a little, but he wasn't joking. He explained that during his life, he'd watched banks take farms, hospitals lose records, landlords ignore veterans, and corporations bury ordinary people under contracts nobody fully read. The people with money, he said, usually count on everyone else feeling too tired to fight back. That line stayed with me, because exhaustion really is part of the system sometimes. Confused people sign things. Embarrassed people stay quiet. Emotionally overwhelmed people delay action, hoping situations magically become less insane. Predators rely on that delay. That's why manipulation often starts small. A relative asking for temporary access to financial accounts. A partner insisting you don't need to worry about paperwork. A sibling pressuring you into verbal agreements instead of documented ones. Then later, when boundaries finally matter, suddenly, everybody acts shocked you wanted protection in writing. I've noticed something else too. Manipulative people hate records. They love phone calls. They love vague conversations. They love statements like, "Come on, we're family." You know what healthy people usually don't fear? Clarity. That lesson became painfully obvious once federal investigators started reviewing the filings connected to my father's case. Everybody suddenly developed memory problems. Interesting timing. Richard's business associates claimed they misunderstood the timeline. Chloe claimed she never reviewed the full legal structure. One consultant actually said he assumed I was probably unreachable indefinitely. Probably. Amazing word. People build entire disasters on top of probably. And somewhere inside all of that chaos, I realized something uncomfortable about myself, too. Part of the reason my father succeeded initially was because I underestimated how far emotionally polished people will go once image and money collide. I kept assuming there was a moral line somewhere. Turns out some people outsource morality entirely and call it strategy. That realization sounds cynical, but weirdly enough, it made me calmer. Because once you stop romanticizing manipulative people, you stop expecting honesty from them. That changes how you protect yourself. I also want to say something directly to anyone listening who feels guilty for becoming more cautious after betrayal. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming aware. There's a difference. Cold people stop caring about others completely. Aware people simply stop handing unlimited access to individuals who repeatedly harm them. That's healthy. Honestly, one of the most dangerous sentences in the English language is probably this. Don't make this a big deal. Every disaster starts there. Financial scams, emotional abuse, boundary violations, family manipulation. Somebody always wants you to minimize your own discomfort so they can continue benefiting from it uninterrupted. My father specialized in that tactic. If I challenged something growing up, he'd smile calmly and say, "Sarah, you're overcomplicating things." Translation? Please stop noticing problems that inconvenience me. A lot of adults are still carrying that conditioning from childhood without realizing it. They apologize for asking questions. They feel guilty requesting documentation. They panic at the thought of disappointing manipulative relatives. Meanwhile, the people exploiting them sleep perfectly fine at night. That imbalance destroys people slowly. And looking back now, I think that's what actually saved me in the end. Not toughness, not anger, not revenge, clarity. The moment I stopped emotionally negotiating with obvious dishonesty, the situation became much easier to solve. Because once you finally see people clearly, protecting yourself stops feeling cruel. It starts feeling necessary. I started sleeping with the bedroom window cracked open again sometime in early spring. That probably sounds insignificant, but after everything happened, silence inside the house felt different for a while. Every unfamiliar sound made my nervous system sit upright like an unpaid security guard. Old houses make noises constantly. Pipes knock, floorboards shift. The refrigerator clicks like it's thinking through personal regrets. For months, every sound felt like interruption instead of home. Then one morning I realized I'd slept through the night without checking locks twice. That's how healing usually happens. Quietly. Not dramatically. By then, the legal cases against Richard and Chloe were still crawling through federal court systems. But honestly, I stopped organizing my life around updates from attorneys. That surprised people. A few friends kept asking if I wanted harsher charges. Bigger penalties, public statements, revenge interviews. But revenge gets exhausting after a while. You eventually realize some people already destroyed themselves long before consequences officially arrived. The courtroom just introduced them to the math. One afternoon, I was repainting the downstairs hallway while Elias sat nearby criticizing my music choices like a retired prison warden. "You know every song you play sounds like somebody driving through emotional debt," he complained. "It's jazz. It's unemployment music." Fair criticism, honestly. I kept rolling paint across the wall while sunlight moved through the front windows, and for the first time in a long time, the house actually felt peaceful again. Not perfect, peaceful. Big difference. That's another thing I wish more people understood. Closure is not always dramatic. Sometimes closure is simply reaching a point where toxic people stop occupying premium real estate inside your mind. That's it. No screaming speech required. No perfect apology. No cinematic family reunion during Christmas snowfall. Sometimes closure is paying your bills, drinking your coffee in peace, and realizing nobody controls your emotional weather anymore. That realization changed me more than the courtroom ever did. Because growing up around someone like Richard teaches you dangerous habits without you noticing. You start measuring your value through usefulness, performance, achievement, approval. Everything becomes conditional. And when you live like that long enough, you forget what healthy relationships actually feel like. Healthy people do not require constant emotional negotiations. Healthy people don't punish boundaries. Healthy people don't make you feel guilty for protecting your peace. That sounds obvious when said out loud, but a lot of adults listening to this story probably know exactly how hard it is to believe emotionally, especially if you grew up inside families where guilt worked like currency. Mine definitely did. If you disappointed my father, he wouldn't yell. Worse, he'd become calm, cold calm, the kind that made entire rooms tense up during dinner. Meanwhile, Chloe learned how to survive by adapting to that system emotionally, and I learned how to survive by becoming competent enough to avoid needing anything. Neither of us ended up healthy because of it. That's the hidden tragedy underneath stories like this. Manipulative family systems damage everybody differently. Some people become dependent. Some become hyper-independent. Both responses usually come from the same wound. I think that's why I stopped hating Chloe eventually. Don't misunderstand me. I still believe she made terrible decisions. But somewhere beneath the designer clothes and financial disasters was a person raised inside the same emotional economy I was. She just adapted differently. And honestly, understanding that gave me more peace than anger ever did. A few months later, I received a handwritten letter from a woman in Ohio who saw the news coverage online. She wrote that she finally removed her brother from her bank accounts after 20 years of manipulation because my story made her realize family loyalty should not require financial self-destruction. I sat in my kitchen reading that letter twice, then a third time, because suddenly this whole experience stopped feeling isolated. There are so many people quietly carrying relationships that survive entirely through guilt, fear, obligation, or emotional exhaustion. People stay because leaving feels selfish. People tolerate disrespect because conflict feels terrifying. People confuse access with love. And I understand that now in a way I never did before. But here's the truth I finally learned. You are allowed to build a peaceful life even if somebody else gets angry about your boundaries. That is not cruelty. That is adulthood. One cold morning near the end of March, I stood on the front porch holding terrible gas station coffee while the sun came up over Alexandria. The neighborhood looked normal again. Dog walkers, school traffic, a guy jogging in expensive athletic gear despite looking emotionally opposed to cardio. Life moving forward. Elias opened the front door behind me wearing his old army sweatshirt and immediately smelled the coffee. "Good Lord," he said. "Did you brew that in a radiator? I bought it for convenience." That's what weak people say before drinking poison. Then he shuffled back inside, muttering about civilization collapsing. I laughed harder than I expected. Real laugh. Not survival humor. Not courtroom sarcasm. Just normal human laughter standing outside my own home. And right there, watching the sunrise hit the porch railing my father once tried to sell out from under me, I understood something clearly for the first time in years. Home is not the place where people share your blood. Home is the place where your dignity remains safe. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after betrayal, protect your peace from people who thought they owned access to it, or learn boundaries the hard way, subscribe to the channel. Because some of the hardest battles people fight never happen in public, and surviving them changes everything.